We are honored tonight to have Mr. Jim Stikeleather with us. He's the Executive Strategist of Innovation for Dell Services. For more than 25 years, Jim has designed, developed, and implemented information and communication feedback technologies that has helped businesses and institutions succeed. Organizations worldwide rely on Jim for guidance on digital infrastructure, evaluation of emerging technologies, and strategic guidance on their applications. He participates in international technology standards bodies, has multiple book and industry article contributions to his credit, and advises a number of technology incubators. Jim's leadership experience includes technology-based service startups and turnarounds, as well as the information technology departments within large global enterprises. Additionally, as I mentioned before, he holds 2 patents. Came to Dell via Perot Systems, where he was a founder of the Technical Resource Connection, or TRC, which was acquired by Perot Systems in 1996. Currently, Jim serves as the Executive Strategist of Innovation for Dell Services, which is an approximately $8 billion IT services arm of Dell Computer, where he leads a team of information technology and business experts who identify, evaluate, and assess the future potential of new technologies, business models, and processes to address evolving business and economic and social trends for the company and for their customers. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the podium Mr. Jim Stikeleather.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. Did I turn it on all right? Can you hear me? Okay, now the truth of the story is, he may have said that, but actually I just make things up. I mean, that's really what my job is. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the future. The innovation group within Dell basically performs several functions. One function is we provide foresight to the organization, which is we try and create what are future scenarios, what's the world going to look like in the future. And from those, we try and create themes or major drivers that are associated with those scenarios. Everybody in the company wants to come to work for my foresight group. And part of the reason is things they get to do is they get to read a lot of science fiction. They spend a lot of time in social media looking at what's going on the fringes of the world. They pay a lot of attention to thought leaders, what they're saying, more importantly, sometimes what they've quit saying. I also have an insight group, which is looking at things like the R&D activities inside of the company, patents, legal and regulatory constraints. Basically, they're the ones who take my foresight group and rein them in. In fact, once a year we get together, we put them into a room, and whichever one emerges less bloody is the winner. In reality, what happens generally is the insight group convinces the foresight group that they've been enjoying things too much, the world's not going to look like that. But really interesting breakthroughs happen when the foresight group changes the mind of the insight group that, yeah, we really can do some things. So what I'm going to walk you through today is what has come out of those teams. And I have other responsibilities, but they're not germane to what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's come out of those groups, what they see the future looking like, and what the implications are for the future of information technology groups and chief information officers in particular. The key to where IT is going is IT will probably be the foundation for most innovation within the business community. But the problem with innovation is if I asked everybody in this room to give me a definition of innovation, every one of you would give me a different one. So one of the things we start with is what is innovation? Obviously, the starting point for innovation is new ideas. It's not new ideas in terms of new. It's basically new ideas applied in a different context. For example, we discover maybe something is working in the manufacturing space and we then apply it to healthcare. That is an example of a new idea. It's not a new idea, but it's a new use of an existing idea. It has to be forward thinking. It's not innovation if you basically are working on a problem in the past. If you've already solved that problem, then what's the point of putting any more effort into it? So you need to be forward thinking. Something that's often missed is it has to be feasible. And what do I mean by feasible? Now, a lot of people in a business situation, in business settings, when I talk about my team actually is required to read science fiction, I will generally get giggles or laughs or yeah, right. And then I will point out to them how many of you are walking around with communicators on your belt. And the fact of the matter is we all are. In fact, Star Trek actually underestimated the potential of the communicator because our communicators have the entire sensor array of the Starship Enterprise. We don't only talk on our communicators, but it knows where we are, who we're with, what we're doing, where's the closest restaurant, how to get from point A to point B. That took the entire sensor array of the Enterprise to do. So it's feasible. What's not feasible is the transporter. There's this little law of physics called E equals mc squared. The transporter will never exist, or not very likely to do. So therefore, that's a piece of science fiction that's not feasible. So if something's going to be an innovation, it has to be feasible. You actually have to be able to do it. It has to be viable. Most of you are associated with computers in some way, shape, or form, right? Have you ever heard the term SMOP? Small matter of programming. Anything is possible. It's just a small matter of programming. Well, the fact of the matter is you can do anything once, but for it to be viable, you have to be able to do it over and over again. And that becomes the criteria of a piece of innovation. Lastly, it has to be valuable. If somebody's not willing to pay you something for it or exchange something for it, then there's no real point in doing it. It's not a marketing term, and we also differentiate within Dell innovation and invention. Invention is the process of taking capital and turning it into knowledge. Innovation is the process of taking that knowledge and turning it back into capital by creating something valuable that somebody's willing to pay for. So we make that differentiation. The other thing that we do is most people think of innovation in terms of products and services, but the fact of the matter is some of the most significant innovations that have taken place have been different business models. It has been different process models. Radical changes in the way value is created and value is delivered rather than the actual value itself. The one other thing we do when we talk about innovation is the fact that there is a continuum of innovation. There is what we call incremental sustaining innovation. That's continuous improvement. What you've heard of as Six Sigma. It's doing the things you're doing today better, faster, and cheaper. That's table stakes in the innovation world. There is also this idea that I can take my existing technologies and processes and create a new value proposition for my customers. That's a form of breakthrough innovation. Or I can take new technologies and new processes and deliver the old form of value proposition to my customers. That's also a form of breakthrough innovation. And then once in a while you have new technologies, new products and services, and you create a whole new value proposition, and that's disruptive innovation. How many people in the room think iPod was a disruptive innovation? Now you're all smart, so you're not going to fall for it. He fell for the trap back there. He raised his hand. The fact of the matter is, in most business conferences, everybody will say, yeah, the iPod was very much a disruptive innovation. It wasn't. What was the disruptive innovation? iTunes, a business model. It was iTunes that basically took away, changed the nature of the entertainment industry and how it actually did things. One of the other things that we talk about in terms of innovation, in particular is the Apple example. I'm older than most of you in the room, so you won't appreciate it as well. But one of the things that we talk about is the fact that you ask people, how many people were surprised that a computer company totally rewrote the business model for entertainment? In a group of business people, they'll all say, oh, I was totally amazed. Well, that wasn't the amazing thing. The amazing thing was, why wasn't it Sony? You may not be old enough to remember a thing called the Walkman, but Sony owned the marketplace, they owned the brand, they owned the distribution channel, they owned the technology, and on top of it all, they owned the content at that point in time. But it was Apple that totally reinvented the industry. So that's a definitional form of innovation. Now I'm going to talk to you about how you do innovation. How many people in here are engineers? You're all doomed. And why are you doomed? Because you are being taught to think in a convergent mode. You're being taught to be analytical and to be rational. And the fact of the matter, that's good, but for innovation to take place, you also have to think in a divergent mode. There's a famous quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald that says, the definition of an intelligent man is someone who can keep two totally divergent thoughts in his mind at the same time and still function. And in fact, if you want to be innovative, you're actually going to have to develop this bicameral approach, if you will, of thinking, to be able to think convergently and divergently at the same time. Now, the way that we accomplish it inside of Dell is I have a group of convergent thinkers and a group of divergent thinkers, because it's very hard to get people that can do both. But you actually have to be able to do that. You also have to have a way of thinking about the future. And I sort of alluded to this. We have an architecture of innovation that we've developed at Dell. And it basically involves foresight, what I had described to you, thinking about the future, what the future is going to look like, all of the possibilities. Insight, what are the constraints that are associated with all of those futures. And we then turn that over to our strategic planners to figure out where do we want to play. Because what we produce are scenarios and themes. Here are all the potential scenarios of the future, and here are the driving themes. Our strategy people do things like what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, where do we want to play, where do we need to do improvements. And we then translate all of that into plans and activities so that innovation becomes a managed, repeatable, measurable, monitorable, predictable process within the organization. We aren't relying upon magic to happen here. In addition to that, you have to have a culture of innovation. You have to have an environment which encourages people to think differently, to challenge activities, to have a common vocabulary for talking to each other. Because I refer back to the Apple and the Sony example, what happened to Sony is all of the towers basically got in the way of the communication that allowed the breakthrough of something like iTunes or the iPod. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in the world. And it's really interesting. We're really at an inflection point in what's happening in the business world and the implications for what we in technology will have to deliver to our customers. I'll start with Enterprise 2.0. We are starting to totally rethink the way we organize for work. We're starting to take large organizations and break them down into smaller organizations. We're starting to basically give to other people work that normally would be done inside of an organization. How many of you have had more than one economics course? There is a concept of economic friction. And what economic friction talks about is, and if you've ever had a business course, Peter Drucker used to talk about it a lot, the reason companies get big is basically to reduce economic friction. It is to overcome transaction costs, the costs of getting from raw material to finished product that have nothing to do with the finished product. The accounting department, the HR department, payroll, legal, all of those types of things. Well, in Enterprise 2.0, we're starting to break all of that apart and realize that scale and size are not associated with each other anymore. So we're moving away from large, monolithic, too big to fail organizations into digital business ecosystems of smaller companies that contribute to each other. There's also the issue of Capitalism 2.0. How many people have heard of the 1%ers and the 99%ers? Took over Wall Street, basically sat there and says capitalism is not fair. Well, it sounds kind of like, and I'm going to show my age, kind of a hippie-ish type of thing. But the fact of the matter is, it's the people at Harvard, the London School of Economics, MIT, Sloan, Chicago, University of Chicago, are all saying the same thing. In fact, in May in the Harvard Business Review, there was a big article about the inevitable failure of capitalism because we focus on one thing and one thing only, return on investment, return on asset. And what they compared it to is peacock feathers. You know, peahens select peacocks for their wonderful tail feathers. The only problem is they've done such a good job of selecting them, peacocks can't exist in the wild anymore. They can't get away from predators, they're doomed. And we've kind of done the same thing with capitalism. So there's a rethink about how we create value and what the definition of value is. Management 2.0. You are what we refer to as the new generation of workers. You don't work the way we do. You work very differently. You're motivated very differently. And as a consequence, all of the philosophies, principles, and practices for management that we have today were designed to take an agrarian workforce and turn it into an industrial workforce, to get them to do the same thing over and over again with predictability and quality. That's not what we need you to do anymore. We need you to be creative. We need you to be problem solvers. And it turns out that the things that incent people to solve problems are the absolute opposite of what incents people to basically do the same work over and over again. So a rethink of management, a rethink of economics, Going back to your economics course, how many people remember the fundamental principle of economics? The one assumption all of economics is based on. The rational decision maker. How many of you are rational decision makers? Humans aren't. So the fundamental principles of economics are all wrong. And in fact, you're starting to see it. You're seeing behavioral economics come to the forefront. You're seeing behavioral finance begin to take over in the areas of investments and managing investments. So the whole concept of economics is being rethought. And on top of that, the mathematicians have showed up finally. You know, most economists are basically statisticians. Most mathematicians will tell you statisticians are really not mathematicians. Well, the mathematicians have showed up, and they're now applying the principles of complex adaptive systems theory to economics, which gets a whole different set of results than what traditional economics would predict. And then what's really interesting is IT is the thing that's enabling all of this to take place. What you see up here are just 10 of the major themes that my group are working on. How many people have heard the term big data? It ain't big data. It's smart everything. Smart everything precludes big data. Smart everything is what's creating big data. If you just look at big data as a big data problem, you're going to miss all of the implications that are associated with smart everything. There are sensors appearing everywhere. You have a phone that knows where you are, what you're doing, who you're with, what's the last thing that you bought, where are you going, what are you shopping for right this minute. That's a lot of information that you've got to maintain the context of if you really want to. So that's part of smart everything. And on top of that, we have refrigerators that are now smart. We have stoves that are now smart. You have a car, which is now extremely smart. It's telling the world where you're going and what you're doing and how fast you're driving. In Asia, they have smart toilets. How many people are familiar with the new offering from Progressive Insurance? It's that little thing you take and you plug into your car, and now they know how you drive, and what do? They give you a discount if you're a good driver, right? Now let's assume you have a smart toilet. And you have a healthcare insurance company. You're laughing, guys, but that's where we're heading up to. So that's some of the things that we talk about: smart everything, work mobility. How many of you basically go into an office, sit down, and do work? Don't do it. The work goes wherever you are. If you're like me, you spend a lot of time in Starbucks doing your work, and other places, but we're not going to talk about that. But it's not just that work itself is mobile, that you do work in a mobile sense. The work itself has become mobile, and it's now crossing enterprise boundaries. That I may start a transaction on my computer, and it may go to my payroll company to do one thing, and then go from the payroll company to my benefits company, to go from my benefits company back to my HR department. So work itself has become mobile in this process. Before I go to this slide, one of the things that we've learned in my group, how many people think technology drives change? And you're used to me now, so only a few of you are going to be foolish enough to raise your hands. It doesn't. Technology enables, facilitates, and accelerates changes that want to take place already. When you start really examining what we think are the changes that were driven by technology, at the fringes you can see people were already trying to do those things. They just didn't have the capabilities available to them. So one of the major changes that we've done in our forecasting process is we don't look at technologies and say this is what it's going to change. We look at the changes that are taking place in the economy, in the social situation, the government regulatory situation, socially what people are doing, and let those dictate what changes want to take place, and then back in look at the technologies that will enable, accelerate, or facilitate that. So we put all of this together, and we come out with what are scenarios. The first scenario that we've been working on is something we call the serendipity economy. You know, one of the basic concepts of business is I create value as I go through my supply chain and my manufacturing process. That work in process has a certain value. The concept of the serendipity economy is that value only exists in a moment. It's there and then it totally disappears. Your smartphones are a good example of that. Your smartphone has a certain value, right? I can make a phone call with my smartphone. Now you're in a strange city you've never been in before and you're lost. Value of the smartphone went up in that instance, didn't it? Because it has a GPS and a map situation, map application. You can now figure out not only where you are, but how to get to where you want to go to. So the value of that smartphone went from here to there real quick. And once you get to where you're going to, it's gone again, right? Now, as you're looking at your smartphone and you're walking down the street, you realize you're hungry. You go to Yelp and say, you know, I really like Chinese food. Is there a Chinese restaurant nearby? Yes, there's one right here. So suddenly the value went up even more. And on top of that, you have 4 friends in the city that you didn't know about. You want me to give them a call and you can meet them for lunch. That's the serendipity economy. Value takes place in instant. Has a lot of implications associated with it. The key one is that companies move away from delivering products and services and move towards making capabilities available to their customers. That the customers can then combine into a value proposition in that particular moment. How many people have ever done any complexity theory work or looked at complexity theory? What we're finding, very good, Santa Fe Institute, right? Ah, cool. What we're finding is, and this doesn't go over very well with business IT people. What we're finding is the world that business has been living in is basically a simple world. Now they won't, they'll go, wait a minute, you obviously haven't implemented SAP anywhere, have you? No, it's actually a very, very simple world because the rules are it's a very simple world. And what you have in a simple environment is if you want to succeed, you apply best practice. I don't know if any of you have been involved with commercial IT, but every IT shop in the world is pursuing best practice. We always want to do best practice. Well, the problem is that only works in a simple world. When you start moving into this idea of a serendipity economy, that basically things only exist for an instant, and you need to be able to deliver value in instance, you have now moved over into a complex world. In the process, you've moved through a complicated world. So you begin moving away from concepts like best practice and moving into things like having a portfolio of best practices that you can apply given to the specific situation. Or creating novel and emergent practices, things that you're doing instantaneously on the fly. Total rethink of the way we've been running IT for years and years and years. The other thing that comes across in the concepts of the serendipity economy is if you've read Peter Drucker, one of the things he talks about is the only reason a company should exist is to create a customer. That's one of his fundamental precepts. And on top of that, he says the sole purpose of a company should be to be a buyer for the customer. Not to go sell the customer something, but the customer comes to you and say, I need X, and you go figure out how you're going to deliver X to that customer. Well, we're moving into a world that's now a possibility thanks to the internet, thanks to us in IT. We've created all of this capability where customers now have access to way more than they've ever had before. So the key to success is to move companies away from being competitive to moving companies into being collaborative. I referred to Sony and the fact that they weren't able to come up with the idea of the iPod and iTunes because they were so fixed in their silos. What you find when you study innovation is most innovation takes place in the white space. It takes place across these silos. And the same thing is true. Most innovation that you see now is actually taking place when multiple companies come together to do something new, unique, and different. So as a consequence, we're moving away from a world of competition to a world of collaboration. Basically, Edward de Bono has written a book called Serpetition, where he basically says the only way you will be able to survive is if you own your customer, and the customer always calls you first, and then you turn around to your competitors, your suppliers, your partners, or whoever, or even other customers, be able to meet their needs. It's, again, a radical rethink of how we actually conduct business, and the consequence of this is the formation of digital business ecosystems. How many people remember, have ever heard of Henry Ford's River Rouge plant? Henry Ford, when he was creating the Ford Motor Company, had this idea, And he basically owned everything from the iron mines and the coal mines, turned the iron into steel, all the way out to the dealerships, to the car, totally vertically integrated. We are now going to a world where that's totally reversed, totally changed. That you don't, unless you specifically are the best at doing it, it creates value for your customer, or you're required to do it for legal and regulatory reasons, you won't do it anymore. Totally the opposite of vertical integration. We also need to change the way that we manage our people. This is the whole concept of Management 2.0. Many people have heard of Gary Hamel. He's from the London School of, Professor Hamel, London School of Economics. He's created something called the Management Innovation Exchange. He has been driving this concept of Management 2.0. And it changes the precepts of management. Basically, we move from traditional management planning to one of preparation. If you're talking about something like a serendipity economy, you can't plan for what people are going to need. But what you can do is you can prepare yourself to be able to supply capabilities whenever they're required. You move from directing people to mentoring people. Instead of telling you what to do, I began explaining how to do things and different ways of doing things and what works and what doesn't work in the past. You move away from staffing to engaging. If you haven't read it, there's actually two wonderful books by a gentleman by the name of Dan Pink. One is called Free Agent Nation. And what he's talking about is the economy is evolving, that most of you, when you're my age, and you'll be young whippersnappers then because of the way medicine is progressing, when you're my age, you won't work for a company, you'll work for yourself. We will all be independent contractors that basically come together on demand to deliver values and services as companies need them. Have any of you heard of a company called Topcoder? You should take a look. Google Topcoder and go take a look at their business model. It is a company made up of, I think they have less than actually 40 employees, but they have 4,000 members. And what happens in Topcoder is if I'm a company and I need something, I go to Topcoder, I give them the requirements, and then the 4,000 members form up in teams and compete and actually deliver what I've asked for, and I get to pick which one I like best, and I only pay for the one that I get. Total rethink. Now what's interesting about Topcoder, in May of this year, they had their first member cross $1 million. One person who made $1 million in less than 6 months doing this kind of work. Now, it's not as Darwinian as it sounds because they actually reward I may pick Team A's solution. They also pay who came in second, who came in third, and who came in fourth. So it's not a take all or nothing type thing. Well, what that means is, in the world that we're moving to, instead of hiring employees, I have to create an environment where people would like to work on things. I have to engage people. It becomes a voluntary effort. How many of you contribute to open source? Oh, good. Oh, if you think about it, you have people working, and most open source actually doesn't come from the academic world. When you really look at it, a lot of it comes from basically people who have full-time day jobs are being paid big bucks for, and then on their own, in the evenings, they contribute open source software. It's because it's interesting to them. It's engaging to them. So I was talking about Dan Pink. You should take a look at Dan Pink's Free Agent Nation because that's probably how you're going to work in the future. And he also has a book called Drive, which talks about how if you're going to do creative work, if you're going to do problem-solving work, that the traditional types of management that we have in place today don't work. The new workforce. I'm going to talk about you guys for a little bit. In the old days, we had it easy. You'd hire somebody and you'd say, look, welcome aboard, there's your desk, there's your phone, there's your computer, and there's the software that you're allowed to use. Have a nice day. I hire one of you guys, what happens? You walk in the door with your own IT infrastructure, and I got to make mine work with it, right? You're different. So that's one problem, opportunity, challenge, how you want to look at it. There's another one. There's my generation workforce. How many people have heard the term baby boomer? Okay, you all know that, I fit the concept of the baby boomer, and we've known for 30 years that we baby boomers are about now approaching the retirement age, right? So for 30 years, we know that the majority of the current American workforce was going to retire. How many companies implemented the knowledge systems, the institutional memory systems to preserve all of the stuff that we have in our head as we retire, forget, or die? And the answer is none. So we have that problem. And oh, we have another problem. The way we remember things, the way we teach things, the way we learn things is very different than the way you learn things, the way you remember things, and the way you would like to be taught. So we have that problem. So, oh, another problem. In addition to bringing your own IT infrastructure with you, how do you go about solving problems? Social networks. My generation did a lot of time, we did a lot of research, we thought about things, we focused on it, we might talk to one or two people. You encounter a new problem, what's the first thing you do? Dear Google. So we got that. And if you don't get the answer on Google, what do? You go to your social network, you say, hey, I've got this really neat, interesting problem at work. I've never seen it before. Have any of you guys seen this problem and you know a good solution? Now, as a business person, that's pretty cool, because all of a sudden I've literally got thousands of people working on my problem that I may not have wanted the rest of the world to know that I had. So you work differently. You work by, and you'll appreciate this. When I'm talking to a business group, I say one of the things that's different about this cohort that's coming into work is you guys work 7 by 24. And of course, all the old business guys like me start laughing their heads off, and not the ones I've met. Well, you do. You get up in the morning. You get on, you do a little bit of work, and you go for your run. Then you come back, and you do a little bit of work, and you take your shower. Do a little bit more work, and you head over to Starbucks, meet your friends. You might do a little bit of work while you're at Starbucks. And then maybe you go see a movie or do something else, and you come back and do a little bit of work. You basically work 7 by 24. You just do it in little increments throughout the 7 by 24. Now, the problem that it presents from the business perspective is, first off, don't you get really upset when your computer doesn't work? Suddenly, we business guys who basically kept our systems up 8 to 5 now have to keep them up 7 by 24 by 52. Because you tend to be oblivious to things like holidays and Sundays and Saturdays and stuff. You're still doing this incremental work. So that's one problem. The other problem is, for some reason, you guys won't get on the same schedules. You'll work one increment, you'll work another increment, So I literally have to move all of my systems which were designed for synchronous work patterns into systems that do nothing but asynchronous work patterns. You guys are more of a problem than you're worth, it's a problem. If you get a chance, you really should take a look at Dan Pink's Drive. If you don't want to read the book, there's a wonderful YouTube video out there. You just basically Google Dan Pink and RSA, and it will take you, or Dan Pink and Drive, and it will take you to that video. That's 15 minutes you'll spend. Now, I alluded to it, but we're totally rethinking how we organize companies. We're basically calling them fractal organizations now. We're basically taking away all of the things that don't create value for our customers, that we aren't the best at doing, or we aren't required to do for legal or regulatory reasons, and giving them to other companies to do for us. We're becoming customers for them. That's the evolution of business. You're starting to see companies shrink because of that. The other thing it does is it changes the way that you get work accomplished. Because what you're doing is you're setting things in motions as opposed to managing a project, how we traditionally do things. You're basically saying, here's the things I want to have happen, and now I'm going to have my ecosystem basically solve the problem for me. Large companies are having a hard time with this, but small companies are being very, very successful at it. And a good example of that, if you're familiar with NodeXL, NodeXL is an open source product that you can actually go get, and it will look at a social network and monitor a social network for you. And you see the little graph up there on the left. That's actually a small California startup company that had, quote unquote, an intractable technical problem, posted it to their social network, and literally within hours had over 2,000 engineers and scientists working on it for free. And eventually the problem was solved. Now, when I talk to a business group, their first reaction is, what do you mean, for free? And it's good. And I said, well, yeah. But the other thing is, I don't care how good your organization is or how good your business is. I'm willing to bet you can't get 2,000 of your employees working on one problem within 2 hours if your life depended on it. fact, you probably can't get 2,000 of your employees working at one problem at the same time anyway. So the fractal organization and the concept of Enterprise 2.0 is another major change that's taking place. And if you're really interested in knowing the impact on organizations, Don Tapscott has a great book called Wikinomics, which is a total rethink of economics and how organizations work in those environments. And that's just, and by the way, all of these slides, I'll leave you a copy and they'll be available to everybody if they would like to have them. Now, talk to you about a whole bunch of themes that are going on. What is the consequence of all of this? The consequence is the successful organization of the future has to be a socially enabled enterprise. You move away from a transactional orientation and move to an orientation of collaboration, cooperation. You are driven by people coming together dynamically and doing the work as opposed to forming up teams and making activities happen. It's a total rethink in how we basically run our businesses. And one could almost argue the concept of running a business kind of goes away in this environment. You're basically creating affiliations to accomplish goals. Within the business community, there's been a lot of work in terms of successful companies, and the most successful companies have purposes. And those purposes generally are not to make the stockholders rich. The purposes are generally associated with something of more social value. And in fact, what you see happening in the socially enabled enterprises is that's where you're seeing more and more productivity, more and more performance, and actually some of the best profits that you see taking place. And how many people, I mean, most of you know what Facebook is, right? If you look at how Facebook operates, it's totally a socially enabled organization. They have very few projects, very few planning. They basically bring groups together and they do their work. There's another very, very large company that operates exactly the same way. It's called Google. So, what does all of this mean for IT and jobs inside of IT and how we operate IT? Well, basically it means the fundamental purpose of IT is going to move from doing transactional type of activities to enabling the socially enabled enterprise. Now, my group did a whole bunch of research and came up with these. We then went and validated it by actually sponsoring research from Harvard, the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Corporate Executive Board, and we did a joint study of you guys on with Intel. And some interesting things come out of this. First off, the key role of the CIO will move away from Chief Information Officer to Chief Innovation Officer. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, within a company, what department more than any other sees the whole company? Sees the white space. All transactions flow through the IT department. Nothing can happen without the computers getting involved, right? So suddenly, other than the CEO, there's only one person in the company that sees the entire company. It's the CIO. Now, the CEO generally isn't very technologically oriented. In fact, most CEOs still have their secretaries doing their email for them, believe it or not. I didn't believe it, but there's a study that actually says that. So, who's the one person who sees the entire company and understands the possibilities, the potential, and the promise of the technologies and where the technologies are going? So who is the one person who can bring the business and the future together and identify opportunities for innovation? It's the Chief Information Officer. So IT is going to evolve into that role. What that means is IT will move away from transactions, infrastructure, technology, code, the things all of you got into this business for. It's still there, it's just under the covers, but the actual business IT function begin focusing on collaboration, choreography, and orchestration across all of the participants in the digital business ecosystem. The people who have got to have their systems integrate with my systems, be able to deliver value to my customer. And the movement to services. IT moves away from delivering applications to delivering services. And if you think about it, one of the earlier slides had consumerization in it. Consumerization is a major theme inside of what's happening inside of IT. Think about apps on smartphones. They're really services. They're not applications in the sense we think about applications in IT. And in fact, the most sophisticated of the apps on smartphones are aggregators of other people's services. Where are my friends? Where's the Chinese restaurant? How do I get there? That's a single app, but it's using multiple services to be able to get there. The key thing is if you have been inside of commercial IT for the last few years, what you had been facing as your number one priority is efficiency. Take 10% out of the budget. Take 10% out of the budget. Take 10% out of the budget. That doesn't work anymore because IT now has to move away from a focus on efficiency to a focus on efficacy. I have to move away from scale issues and make my IT be adaptable. The speed with which I can deliver services is much more important than the cost the services are to deliver. So you're beginning to see a very radical shift in the way that IT, the expectations of IT by the business, in particular the CEO. And most of this came out of the Harvard study, that the leading CIOs in the world, it was 500 companies across Asia, Europe, and North and South America. The shift is to the expectation that if I just want efficiency, I'll just outsource it and give it to somebody else. And you're starting to see that happen. What I want on my IT group is I want them to be effective. I want their speed, my ability to respond to my competitors, my ability to entice you guys to come work for me because you are the future, the ability to enable engagement, the ability to basically do things like crowdsourcing and collaborative co-creation of value. Much different than traditional transactional systems. One of the other things that came out of this study is we've reduced it to the IT meditations. If you are a CIO today, every morning you should get up and do this meditation. And the meditation is, I have to continue in the role of being a pragmatist, but I also now have to become a visionary. If you've had much experience with traditional commercial chief information officers, they're not terribly visionary. In fact, we jokingly refer to them as chief infrastructure officers. They like to keep the lights on, but that's about all that they want to do. They now have to truly become visionaries and see not only where the technology can go, but how the technology can radically change the business. And to do that, they also have to take on the role of business leader, which is not something they have been in the past. They actually have to marry up the technology with the business and say, this is what our future is going to be. They also have to change the nature of the relationships they have. Most CIOs don't really interact with CEOs terribly well. They generally don't interact well with CFOs, but that's who they normally have to interact with. They generally don't interact with the customers, rarely if all, and sometimes not even with suppliers other than their IT suppliers. So in effect, what they have to do is start rethinking their relationships, who they interact with, the resources and what they allocate them to, the questions they ask, what they focus on, and what they're trying to achieve. And what we've done is we've constructed this into a meditation. We're actually running a seminar across the globe right now, bringing CIOs in and running them through some exercises. And their goal is to get up every morning and say, what is the one thing I'm going to stop doing across these 4 areas? What's the one thing I'm going to start doing that I'm not currently doing? And what are the things I'm going to start to do differently? And the issue is we are at an inflection point. Most companies will no longer be brick and mortar. They will basically be cyber. The other thing that's come out of these studies is what does IT of the future look like? And what we see is we see 3 levels of IT. At the lowest level is what we're calling fabric. You've probably heard of virtualization. That's the starting point. You've probably heard of cloud. Cloud is the next step beyond virtualization. You're starting to hear vendors talk about converged infrastructure, which basically says I no longer think about compute, network, and storage. It's all just one thing, and I don't have to manage it as independent things. Some interesting work being done in the area of content-centric networking, content-centric storage, and content-centric compute, which is basically saying I no longer have to know anything about physical addresses or anything else. I just reference the content and it magically appears and is available to me. I use the term magical, but the fact of the matter is Xerox PARC actually has a lot of this actually running. A guy by the name of Van Johnson, who, along with Vint Cerf, were kind of the inventors of the internet. Van Johnson actually has this stuff working. The fabric is what will be, if you think about what internal IT groups normally do, 80% of their efforts are basically infrastructure, doing this low-level work. When you get to fabric-based computing, that kind of goes away. That work basically begins disappearing. It's still there, but it's highly leveraged. What happened is it's been automated and it's been abstracted up. How many people do assembly language work here? Few and far between. Used to be that's all that we did. I'll tell you how old I am. My first programming job was on an IBM 1620. And if any of you know what that is, you now have aged yourselves as well. The only way you could, not only did we not have, we didn't even use, it was machine language. There was dials on the front and you would turn the dial set and you press a button and that would store the value and then that's how you programmed it. I miss the good old days. Well, the same thing is happening in the world of infrastructure. Nobody does that anymore for the most part. We're dealing with high-level languages like Java, and sometimes we're not even dealing with those. We're basically just issuing search queries and turning those into some type of programmatic activity. So the same thing is happening at the infrastructure level. Then on top of the fabric, what you're starting to see is this evolution of industrialized services. A commercial IT shop moves away from the delivery of services to the procurement, management, monitoring, provisioning of services. So rather than actually delivering the services, they basically become the procurement department for all things associated with information. And then on top of that, the third level is basically the organization-specific services. This is where the things like digital business ecosystems live. This is where all the tools for collaboration, integration, choreography, orchestration. You're starting to see, how many people have heard the term infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service? Well, now the new thing, the big thing, is this concept of business services as a service. I don't even care about the IT. I'm just going to go to this company and all of my transactions will be taken care of. I don't even know that IT is running under that. That's what IT of the future begins looking at and what we begin managing to. How are companies getting there? It's basically a three-step process that they're beginning to go through, and you're starting to see the beginnings of this now. First off is this concept of standardizing. Generally considered a bad word. Most people think standardizing means do it my way and or the highway. But actually what standardizing is saying is first and foremost, decide what it is that you're going to do that creates value for your customers, that you're the best at in the world, or you're required to do for legal or regulatory reasons, and then get rid of everything else. What's the highest form of efficiency? Stop doing something you don't need to be doing. Absolute efficiency. So that's the starting point of standardization. Then once you've standardized, start modernizing. Come up to speed on the newest technologies and the newest ways of doing things. There's a wonderful presentation. You can Google it and generally find it. It's by Rob Carter. He's the CIO of Federal Express. It's called The Four Horsemen of Dominant Design. And what he argues in his presentation is we have reached an inflection point with information technology in the business space where we no longer have to be worried about which server, which storage mechanism, what networking technology do we use. The dominant designs have been determined and we'll see significant productivity because of that. So that's what you want to do when you modernize. The next thing you want to do is you want to simplify. The starting point of simplification for most people is to begin virtualizing their environments. Because what virtualization does is it starts abstracting out the hardware from management of IT. If you have a highly virtual environment, you're not managing servers and storage and everything anymore. You're managing virtual instances. Now, under the cover, somebody is doing it, but you're bringing up the level of abstraction that you're dealing with it. And then you begin centralizing, and not centralizing in terms of these people are responsible for that. That's the old management 1.0 style. But centralizing in there's one point of truth. There's one place you go to when you need resources. If you go to most IT shops, even if they virtualize, you say, hey, I need a server, a virtual server. Okay, well, talk to Joe and get an IP address for me, and Joe will give me the IP address, and I'll spin up the server. Oh, you're going to need some storage to go with that? Okay, you need to talk to Marty and let him get a couple of Luna addresses. And somebody's laughing. Obviously, you've gone through this experience. And I happen to know that you probably experienced here a little bit, too. So that's what we're talking about centralizing is one place, one point of truth, one point point to get what you need. Then the next step is this automation. That what you really want to do is you want to take out as much human interaction in the provisioning of services as you possibly can. Because really where you want to get to is self-service. Think about the serendipity economy for just a second. If value is created in an instant, this moment in time that these things have come together, we have an opportunity to create value. Are you going to be successful if you have to pick up the phone and call and enter in a service request? Not likely. You want people to be able to self-service, and more importantly, you want to be able to anticipate what they're going to need and provide it for them ahead of time. So those are the 3 steps that IT shops are beginning to go through in order to get to the future, which is basically the cloud. The big, huge cloud. Now, how many people think cloud is a new concept? It's not. In fact, in 1961, John McCarthy, he was a National Science Merit Fellow, he won a Turing Award. In 1961, at the MIT Centennial Celebration, he gave a speech. And in that speech, he described the ultimate inevitable endpoint for all information technology. And it was the cloud. He didn't use that term, but it was the cloud. And actually, if you do basically a history of IT and where it's going and all, you find that it all leads to this end state. Now, will there be one big, huge cloud? Yeah, probably not. But there will be lots of clouds. We will federate across clouds. We will basically have clouds interacting with each other. So in terms of the future of IT, it is this federation of computing clouds built on top of some type of fabric. Now there's a downside associated with this. How many people have ever watched the movie Westworld? Great movie. Yul Brynner, he's a robot. He's a gunslinger robot. The Westworld was a place, it was the Disneyland for adults. You would go there and all the robots, you could kill them in gunfights, you could use them as slaves. I mean, it was really great, great world. The only problem is the robots were built by computers that were built by computers that were built by computers that were built by computers, and no human understood how any of it worked again. Well, unfortunately, that's kind of the path we're starting to go down. Now, I'll leave you with one thought. And you can just watch this, and I'll tell you what it is as I get to the end. How many people have heard of the book, The World is Flat? It's written by Thomas Friedman. It's a brilliant expose about what's going on in the economic world today, and it's basically saying that there is no economic friction anymore. That, if I have an idea, I can actually have it produced in China, I can have my support in India, I can have sales activities going on in Europe, and I can all do it instantaneously. Well, he wasn't quite right. A guy by the name of Aronica and Rambu basically wrote a book and said, no, the world's not flat. The supply chain of the world is flat. The demand chain is still extremely erratic because of government regulations, social differences, and whatever. So basically they say, nah, the world's not so terribly flat. You guys enjoying the little chart? I see you're all fascinated by it. Well, I love this. Well, no, they're wrong. It's not that it's not flat, and it's not that it's flat, it's curved. It's really curved, right? So Schmick basically wrote, well, they're both right, which is, it's great. One says X, one says Y, and you can come in and say, hey, you're both right. Or you can say you're both wrong, but if you say you're both right, nobody argues with you. So Schmick came in and he basically said, look, they're right in the sense that the supply chain is flat. There is no friction in supply chain anymore. I mean, literally. I can do a design, email it to China, and have it here via Federal Express within 24 hours. I mean, literally, supply chain is basically flat. Demand chain is not flat yet. So what happens when you have erratic demand driving a perfect supply chain? Catastrophic errors. Case in point. The mortgage crisis. You had a perfect supply chain that could deliver mortgages and derivatives based upon mortgages anywhere in the world. And you had an erratic demand chain which basically didn't know what it wanted, wasn't paying attention to it, and basically disrupted it. So the consequences of all of this is we're now in an environment where the opportunity for making a mistake has catastrophic or chaotic consequences. Now, how many people have figured out what's been going on with the chart? That is from 2007 to, I think it goes to February of 2012. I don't remember now for sure. Transactions per second on all the stock exchanges in the United States. Now, what's interesting about that is as you get closer to what the economists call a perfect economy. Anybody remember what that is? It's when my supply chain and my demand chain are perfectly matched. There's an interesting consequence of a perfect economy. There is no profit. Because if there's profit, a new entrant will come in and supply at a lower cost, at a lower price, and take away your profit. So the wonderful thing about supply and demand chains is you always have exactly what you want at the price you're willing to pay. The bad thing is nobody makes any money at it. Well, in effect, there actually exists a perfect economy already. It's called the stock exchanges. They're basically, I mean, there's a certain amount of economic friction and knowledge differential. It's almost a perfect economy now. And as a consequence, there is very, very, very little margin in every transaction. So how do you compensate for that? More transactions. That's what you're seeing, and we're moving into 2011. And there we go. That's what's happening in the stock exchange. Now, the reason I use this example is the demand chain is starting to become perfect now. Your ability to get on the, how many people go and buy a car anymore? How many people have recently gone to buy a car? Did you go into the dealer and say, I want to buy this car? No, you got on the internet and say, what car do I want? What are the prices? What have other people in the world been paying for this? In what condition? At what time? What are my insurance rates? What are the deals I can get for financing? You now have all of the information. The reason the demand side was always erratic was the information friction. Buyer and sellers were dealing with different levels of information. What we've now is created a world where that's going away. So what that means is that our everyday economy is going to start looking like that. And the only way you survive there is your ability to be in the moment, ready and able to respond to the opportunity when it presents itself. So I think I went a little long. If you guys have any questions, I'm going to hang around. You can ask questions or whatever. If you want to reach me, you have my email address. If you, I wouldn't necessarily say, because I tend to be very controversial when I actually tweet things. And with that, I thank you very much.